right, let's get started because Laila, I know you have a ton to share with us. So thank you everyone so much for joining us for today's Climate Live K12 session for students, educators, and the public. This is a series of the Columbia Climate School, and I'm Sarah Wagner. I'm a master's student in climate and society at the Climate School, and I'm also the graduate assistant of K12 and continuing education. I'll be facilitating the session today, but I'm mostly so looking forward to speaking with one of my classmates for this session. We have Laila Shaban joining us here. But before we go over to you, Laila, we're just going to share a quick introduction to the Columbia Climate School. So we were founded in July 2020. It's Columbia University's first new school in 25 years, and we're dedicated to advancing transdisciplinary climate research. As a hub for innovative climate solutions, the Climate School brings together experts from across fields to address the most pressing climate challenges of our time. The Climate School is committed to shaping future leaders to drive climate solutions forward in every sector by offering educational programs for degree-seeking students, high school students, teachers, professional learners, and the public. By equipping changemakers with knowledge and skills, the school empowers essential stakeholders in the fight for a just, prosperous society on a healthy planet. So what we're hoping to do with these Climate Live K-12 sessions is to introduce you all to our interdisciplinary work through our experts. We have one more session of this academic year. It's in June, and it's going to be a great conversation about sustainable agriculture with Danny Din, who is the program manager at the Food for Humanity Initiative at the Columbia Climate School. So you can register for that session on our website and check out past sessions on our YouTube page, which I will put in the chat in just a minute. But for now, I'm thrilled to introduce Laila. Laila is an almost graduate of the Masters in Climate and Society program, who is focused on researching marine life and coastal ecosystems. Her work includes seagrass restoration, blue carbon sequestration, and the study of antibiotic resistance in coastal environments. In addition to research, she's passionate about developing educational curricula that enhance science, communication, and engage communities in ocean conservation. Laila is currently working as a community solar intern at Solar One and researching Indian Ocean dipole forecasts with the International Research Institute for Climate and Society. So before I turn it over to Laila, I just want everyone to know that we'll have time for questions at the end. We're really excited to hear from you. The chat is disabled, but the Q&A box is available to you all. So feel free to put questions in at any time, and we'll make sure to get everything answered for you. And then finally, the session is being recorded, and we'll send you all a link for the recording when it's complete. With that, over to you, Laila.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you, Sarah, for that lovely introduction, and Laurel for having me. Today, we're diving into a topic that I usually started talking about as something that doesn't get light or doesn't get the center stage, but recently it seems like it is the hype topic to talk about and has been increasingly in people's conversations. So we're talking about blue carbon ecosystems and how it intersects with climate, biodiversity, and a little bit about how global markets interact with carbon as well. Blue carbon is becoming more important every day, and when I decided to study marine science, I honestly did it because the corals looked cool and I loved scuba diving. But these facts on screen that the ocean generates 50% of the oxygen, absorbs 25% of CO2 emissions, and captures 90% of heat is something that now kind of seems like common knowledge, and people are starting to understand the magnitude of the ocean on our planet. But back when I was choosing what to study, honestly, it was because it was very cool and interesting, but I'm so glad I did because I can't imagine something more important to be working on right now. So yeah, before we dive into the next slide, I want you to think about wetland perceptions and what you perceive when you think about a wetland. Next slide. So this is something that I never really thought of until I started to think about it. We have a lot of vocabulary in our language that links wetlands and swamps to very negative connotations. Uh, the place where much of blue carbon lives is in wetlands, and it hasn't always been seen as valuable. In fact, it's often been the opposite. Think of bogged down, swamped, mired. These are metaphors for problems and not places we protect. And historically, this is exactly what has been happening. Wetlands were drained, filled, or built over in the name of progress. In the US alone, we've lost over 50% of wetlands, and globally, it's estimated that we've lost 50% of wetlands. And yet, they're one of the most important carbon storage on the planet. Yes, next slide. So let's start with the basics. Carbon, what is blue carbon? Blue carbon is carbon that's being stored in coastal and marine ecosystems. The ecosystems absorb CO2 from the atmosphere through photosynthesis and store it in their biomass. But what's crucial about this ecosystem is that they store it in their soil, and this soil is waterlogged, so there's a water layer on top of it, obviously, because it's a wetland, and this area makes it really low in oxygen. So the decomposition happens extremely slowly, locking away the carbon for centuries and even thousands of years. So have you ever seen pictures of the people who were buried under the bogs? There's in some museums, so I don't want to put a picture because it's a bit graphic, but like if a human is buried under a bog or a living creature, it stays pretty intact. So that gives you an idea of how slowly carbon degrades under these wet soils. So coastal blue carbon ecosystems can sequester carbon at rates up to 4 times higher per hectare than mature forests. And the impact is beyond sequestration rates. It's also about the fact that a mangrove can store 3 to 5 hectares of carbon more than a tropical forest hectare. Also, seagrasses, which are often estimated as like the least ecosystem that blue carbon sequesters, can store the equivalent of 2 hectares of temperate forest per hectare. And it's also not just the quantity of carbon per hectare, but the stability. Researchers have highlighted that because these soils are anaerobic or low in oxygen, as I just said, decomposition is so slow that it remains locked away for millennia. And despite this, countries have no formal way to count or credit seagrass carbon with their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. And why? In part, it's to do with economics. So solar and wind generate electricity, which is a commodity, and we can sell it. And we can't really sell this carbon that's being stored because it's not something we can use. So, and then there's the fact that people are skeptical about this. How do we know that carbon is being stored? People just have a lot of skepticism around blue carbon. So yeah, that's a little bit of introduction. Next, I'm going to talk about, when I say blue carbon, usually people are referring to blue carbon captured in natural ecosystems, like what we see in this graph, on this diagram in the bottom left, restoring living blue carbon. When we talk about mangroves, wetlands, etc., this is what usually people talk about, but as I mentioned in the previous slide, blue carbon is just about capturing carbon in the ocean. And this happens through other ways. Humans are trying to figure out new ways to do it that are still being researched, like artificial upwelling and downwelling and alkalinity enhancement, all these sorts of things. These are artificial ways that we're not going to speak about in this presentation. And usually people are not referring to this when they're talking about blue carbon. But technically, these are ways to store carbon in the ocean. And also upwelling and downwelling that naturally occurs is also storing blue carbon. But as I said, this is not typically what's referred to. Usually we're talking about the natural solution. Next. So these are the 3 main ecosystems that I've already mentioned a couple times: seagrass meadows, mangroves, and salt marshes. Seagrasses grow on the seafloor and bury carbon in their sediments. Mangroves have dense root systems, and they not only reduce carbon, but are excellent at reducing storm damage, and they trap sediment from shifting around. And salt marshes are very important in temperate zones and are very effective at capturing carbon and also preventing erosion. Together, these ecosystems are a foundation of coastal carbon storage, and each plays a slightly different role, but they're equally important. Next. This figure shows just the extent of wetlands lost, and as you can see by the top left graph, we see a sharp decline. This graph goes back to the 1700s, and we see that using the maps, you see that this is happening all over the world. It's not restricted to tropical ecosystems, which some people might assume. It's happening everywhere. And on the bottom left, you see why these ecosystems are degrading. We're looking at forestry, we're looking at croplands, urban, so many different types. It's mostly because of people throwing trash into the ocean and also people building and urbanizing and taking out these sediments and ecosystems. These ecosystems for a long time were just seen as like bad, negative, we need to remove. Cities were built on top of them, like New York City, honestly. So yeah. The next slide talks about a little story that is one of my favorite stories to talk about when I'm referring to this. And it happened right where I grew up. I grew up on the coast of Saudi Arabia on the Red Sea. And recently, scientists discovered a bunch more seagrass ecosystems in the Red Sea, and they found it completely on accident because they started tagging sea turtles to see sea turtle migration and where they were moving. And they found 38 previously undocumented seagrass foraging sites, which is crazy because These didn't come up on any satellite maps, and in many cases, they were deeper than traditional seagrass detection methods could reach. So when researchers sampled these areas, they found such impressive carbon stocks. On average, 4.9 kilograms of organic carbon per square meter. That's roughly 5 metric tons per hectare, and that doesn't even include the living biomass, it's just the soil carbon. And these findings are important because they speak to a common challenge in blue carbon policy, undercounting, which is a major issue. Seagrass meadows are hard to map from satellites, especially in waters that are very turbid, which seagrass meadows often occur in turbid waters. And this study just shows how many carbon sinks may be hiding in plain sight and how we still don't understand these ecosystems. We previously thought that seagrasses only grew to a certain depth, and this kind of showed us that they grew to much deeper depths than we thought. And also, it just shows how vital these ecosystems are to the biology living in the area. They found them through tracking sea turtles, and we're going to talk about biodiversity later because it's what I really am excited about. But it highlights how blue carbon conservation is rarely just about the carbon. It's about the biodiversity, the fisheries, the knowledge building, the tourism, everything that's intersected in this ocean ecosystem. So let's talk more specifically about seagrass meadows, since they're the most popular topic in blue carbon. They only cover about 0.1% of seafloor, but they account for an estimated 10 to 18% of the carbon buried in the ocean. This means that they punch far beyond their weight in terms of climate function. So why does blue carbon matter so much? In short, it's because it offers a nature-based solution, which means a solution to a climate problem that is natural and naturally occurring, that tackles multiple problems at once. It doesn't just sequester carbon by pulling carbon out from the air into the ocean, but it helps us adapt to climate impacts already unfolding. For example, the mangroves and marshes act as coastal shields, which buffers from storm surge and waves. And as we know, with climate change, it's not just about the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, but it's about the effects of that carbon in the atmosphere, meaning more storms, more intense storms, more irregular storms. And this kind of storm surge protection is going to be really, really important. Seagrass meadows stabilize sediments, reduce erosion, and of course, my previous slide really highlighted this. It's an important habitat for fish, shellfish, wildlife. It boosts diversity in fisheries. And in other words, we don't just invest in blue carbon because we get the carbon storage, but we get protection for coastal communities, we support livelihoods, and in turn, a better, healthier ocean. So it's not just the ocean's lungs, which people refer to, but because yes, it helps the planet breathe by storing CO2 and giving off oxygen, but it also serves as the kidneys filtering the water and nurseries for the young fish and even the skin for our shores by protecting against coastal storms. So all of this makes seagrass such an important ecosystem ecologically and economically, but nonetheless, one that we're losing. So a little bit of a zoom out, because I don't want to play into this idea that seagrass, wetlands, and marshes are the only blue carbon ecosystems. I showed you other ways humans are artificially storing carbon into the ocean, but the ocean is sequestering carbon in so many different ways, and seagrass is something that we can plant and it's easy for us to do. And as I said, like the amount of carbon stored per hectare is very intense. But we're also talking about a whole ocean where there's so many different ways to sequester carbon. The sediments in the ocean, like the ocean bed, has such high amounts of carbon storage in it. And then also kelp forests, for example, they cover more coastline than mangrove seagrasses combined. And while they don't store carbon in the sediment, they export large amounts of organic matter to the deep sea. And this represents a hidden pathway for long-term carbon sequestration. And there's already organizations working to better quantify that export. Or consider the rhodolith beds, which are those on the right, which are free-living red algae that form calcium carbonate structures. And these beds are widespread along the Pacific and Atlantic and are unmapped. And research has suggested that they function as carbon sinks and sources depending on ocean chemistry. So a lot of research is going to be done on figuring out what that effect is. So expanding our definition, matters for two reasons. First, it gives us more tools in the climate toolbox to figure out how to address this. If we understand how much carbon is being sequestered in the sediment, we can understand what its effects are. And second, it just pushes us to study and protect these ecosystems that are ecologically important, but very invisible in the politics. Next. So a little bit of a concrete example of a case study. This is one of the most celebrated blue carbon stories, and it's the seagrass restoration that happened on the coastal bays of Virginia. This shows what's possible with long-term commitment. In the 1930s, these lagoons had abundant seagrass, but then a disease came and a hurricane wiped them out. And for decades, the seafloor remained barren. And in the early 2000s, scientists volunteered to restore the seagrass by broadcasting 70 million seeds. And you can see the timeline of how it happened from 2001 to 2018, how the extent grew. The results were dramatic. Around 9,000 acres, or 3,600 hectares of healthy seagrass was restored, and this is the largest project of its kind. And what they found was that the water clarity improved, marine life rebounded, fish and scallops returned, and most importantly, this carbon sequestration that followed was really remarkable. Though it wasn't the original goal, which is what I found really interesting reading about this study. The original goal wasn't to restore carbon. Their original goal was just to restore the ecosystem and bring back the marine life and the water filtration capabilities of this ecosystem. But then they started studying how much carbon was sequestered, and that was one of the main drivers for the boom of blue carbon. So as I said, this started in the early 2000s. They started this restoration initiative. The term blue carbon wasn't officially defined till 2009. So it was something that it's very recent, but people have known about these ecosystems and how valuable they are. And so this was the first study that showed habitat restoration can actually really help combat climate change. And so it's a powerful proof of concept that restoration can act as a functioning blue carbon sink when there was none. It was barren land for a really long time before they restored it. Yeah. And this just shows the graph of how much the eelgrass was able to recover. Next. So here's a catch that I often love to skip because I love talking about how it's so lovely to restore these ecosystems and we should invest so much money into it, but the hard truth is that restoring seagrass is hard. It's really hard. I worked at an aquarium, the Aquarium of the Pacific last year in Long Beach, and people still don't know how to grow seagrass in an aquarium. It's still a very finicky process. So these plants are very sensitive to light, temperature, sediment disturbance, water quality. They're not like trees where you can plant in neat rows. Restoration requires careful site selection and hand planting and years of monitoring. But case in point in Virginia, despite a huge amount of success, it did take 2 decades to get all those planted and monitored. It required consistent planting, adaptive methods, and huge amounts of funding. And even with those efforts, initial mortality rates were high and the growth was pretty slow. We have to understand that this doesn't bounce back overnight. We can't expect an ecosystem to bounce back overnight. Also, there's some risks. Studies have shown that disturbing the sediment can release the soil CO2 up to 50% in some cases. So like I said, the CO2 is like in the soil, and the only reason it stays there without decomposing is because the oxygen isn't reaching it, and it can stay there for a really long amount of time. But permanence is a huge issue when you're talking about restoration for credits, whether that's you're doing a forest or a seagrass bed. So a seagrass bed can be thriving for decades, but then vanish in a season. And this was seen in Western Australia in 2010, 2011, where there was a huge heat wave, where more than 20% of the seagrass cover was lost, and then resulting carbon release was estimated over 2 million tons, the equivalent of adding 400,000 cars to the road for a year. So that was pretty devastating, honestly, just that ecosystem being lost, releasing that amount of carbon. But yeah, these are just things to note. People understand these and can work with them. Sorry, I'm going to speed up a bit. And so this is carbon credits. It's essentially a permit representing the reduction or removal of 1 metric ton of CO2. And obviously there's a lot of issues with monetizing ecosystem services and how can we do it. it needs a robust amount of science, it needs strong data, it needs a commitment to long-term permanence. 30 to 100 years, you need to verify that the carbon is going to be stored for that long. In theory, it allows us to value an ecosystem and value nature as a climate asset, but in practice, it's very complex. Next. So my capstone project, which I'll have a link to in the end if you want to read more in depth, there's a report online, is when I worked at the aquarium, we were trying to reduce our net carbon to zero, and they wanted to do that through doing seagrass restoration. And we were trying to see whether it was economically viable to do in Long Beach. And we found that it was really expensive. Almost the restoration was going to be a fraction of the cost of what the credits were going to be for carbon. And a new emerging thing in the field has been stacked benefits. So stacking just the carbon credits with the biodiversity benefits, with the social benefits, all in one, and stacking those benefits together, we found was the effective way to like make people do this restoration in an economically viable way. It wasn't like they were pouring money into the sea and not seeing any return. So yeah, you can read the report on this later. I don't think I have that much time to go into it, or you can ask me more about it in the Q&A. But in the next slide, you'll see that biodiversity credits are booming, and as of very recently, this first article that says biodiversity sign's first ever voluntary biodiversity credit was like this morning. So that was super exciting. This is the first one in the US. Sea Trees at COP16, the biodiversity COP that happened this past year in Colombia, was the first global biodiversity credit. So basically, this is carbon credits. We all know when you plant a tree in the forest, you can get carbon credits for it as any company. But biodiversity credits is trying to value the tree for more than just the carbon it sequesters, or the seagrass for more than the carbon it sequesters. It's the whole ecosystem that it's preserving. This is a whole web of like, how do you measure that? Do you measure how many species are passing by? Like, it is very, very complicated, and that's why it took this long to do it, and it's very hard to verify it. But I was super happy to see that we have another advancement in the field this morning. And actually, you can go on Sea Trees' website and buy a biodiversity credit right now. But yeah, next. This is just a slide talking about regulating credits and understanding that we need a lot better rules. We need better monitoring. Like I said, we don't even know where the seabreads are to monitor them properly. And we need to be able to verify them globally across different environments and ecosystems. And what does progress, next slide. Steps forward is integrating it into policy. Indonesia, Japan, and the UAE now reference mangroves in their national contributions, which is a big shift from even just the last decade. Market regulation, thinking about credit frameworks, thinking about community leadership. The project in Kenya, which is mentioned in this slide, shows what's possible when local communities lead. So you can look into that if you're interested. And investing in data, it's really, really important to invest in data because, as I said, remote sensing can do a lot, but there's still a lot more to be done on like on the ground basis. And then investing in finance. This is not going to be done out of thin air. The project I did for my capstone was figuring out how this was going to be viable. And the way we were thinking about it was by stacking these benefits. So blue bonds, biodiversity credits, these are all things that are going to offer a more sustainable and long-term financing for ecosystem restoration. Yeah, and these are some references you can look at later. It's obviously going to be on the slides, and you can go on to the next slide. This link has the presentation and report for my capstone presentation, which is about carbon credits, blue carbon credits, and then we can go on to the Q&A.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Laila. I didn't grow up near the ocean, and so it's an ecosystem that I'm still getting to know and getting to appreciate. And every time I talk to you, I feel like I appreciate it more and know more about it. So I'm super grateful to you, and I know all our participants are as well. For the audience, now's the time. We have 5 minutes for Q&A. I'll get us started with a few questions as you submit, but you can use the Q&A function to do that. Laila, I'm curious. I know that you, as well as, working so much on ocean conservation, you're also an amazing educator. And I am wondering if you could pass along one thing that each of us in the audience could take away about blue carbon. What would be the one thing that you would have us go tell our networks, friends, colleagues?
I think people are very skeptical that it's like, how can carbon be stored in the ocean? That's such a dynamic environment with currents, and especially when they hear that it's stored in the sediment, like, how does that not get released immediately? I think it's really important to tell people that this has is not something that we just discovered. We've known about the carbon capabilities for almost a century now. We only named it in 2009 because we were trying to sell it. But also just understanding that the rainforest can do so much and planting trees in the forest can do so much, but these ecosystems already exist and have so many other benefits, not to mention that they can sequester 4 times more carbon than a plot of l- forest. So I think that's just being excited about what's happening in the ocean is something that is just now happening. And like even Attenborough's new documentary is really exciting because I've had so many people talk to me about it. Like, oh, I didn't know the ocean was like that valuable. And it's been a lot. It's just I've seen this shift in the past 5 years that I've been studying this, and I think it's just so important to bridge disciplines as well. Like I tried to talk about policy a little bit and finance and how the science fits into it, and there's so many other disciplines that can go into play. I went to a webinar. I went to a Climate Week event that talked about art and blue carbon and how we can use art in the ocean. Like they were sinking art pieces to the ocean that could help sequester carbon. So yeah, there's
Wow.
lots of things to do.
That is so amazing. Thank you. And it's great to hear that it can really connect with everything that we're all working on and everything that we care about. Like the ocean can be a part of that. And you did do a beautiful job of connecting blue carbon to, like you said, policy and financing frameworks. I know you mentioned really briefly sort of the like adaptation benefits of restoring these ecosystems. I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about that.
Yeah, of course. I think the ocean can play a huge role. Like even just planting oyster beds, which New York is trying to do, like with the Billion Oyster Project, and it's happening all over the world. These kind of coastal interfaces where humans interact with the ocean are becoming more and more dangerous as sea level rise occurs, as hurricanes and storms become more intense. These interfaces are becoming way more dangerous, but these are the places where people live, and often people with a lot of money. So I think it's very important for that money to be targeted to natural, sustainable solutions that are not just building up a seawall, but rather solutions that benefit the ecosystem and benefit them. Like I didn't talk about oysters because it's a presentation about blue carbon, but even oysters like grow faster than sea level rise and can completely protect people from sea level rise if we let them give them the space to grow. So yeah. And it's just important to remember that blue carbon is not a substitute for decarbonization. And we have to use these ecosystems not to justify the continued use of fossil fuel emissions. So it's not because we can sequester carbon in the ocean that we can continue to produce fossil fuels. So you can't offset your way out of structural dependence. Yeah.
So true. I think if we've learned anything, it's that we have to do all the solutions simultaneously as much and as best that we can. We have a question in the Q&A. This is such an interesting one. I'm excited to hear your thoughts on it. Monique Scott wanted to know, how would I differentiate carbon element from CO2, the greenhouse gas, in terms of the idea of blue carbon or carbon capture? They said, I imagine my students thinking more about dead organisms instead of gases. So I'm thinking about I think the question is about like how would you explain to students what the carbon that you're talking about really is?
Yeah, so we are talking about carbon, the element. So the seagrass is obviously photosynthesizing and it takes the carbon from the water just like a plant would from the air and puts it down into the soil as a waste, and releases the oxygen back into the water. So that chemical reaction occurs and the carbon is in the soil sequestered.
Mhm, mhm. And Monique, please feel free to follow up if that, if you are looking for a little bit different information.
Mhm.
One more question, Layla. I know we're just about out of time, but one of our audience members wanted to know it's a suggestion. Oh, this is amazing. Local on Long Island, a group of Indigenous women have been planting seagrasses to deal with eutrophication that results from runoff and cesspool leakage, which has been very successful. So this person says, I wonder if this would be a great opportunity to document blue carbon storage. Have you heard of this project?
I haven't heard of this project, but I've heard of so many other projects that are also using seagrass to combat eutrophication. I didn't talk about nitrogen, but it also stores nitrogen in the sediment, which nitrogen is a huge issue because we keep dumping more and more into the ocean. Um, but yeah, that's such a cool project. I love how it's led by community leaders as well, which is pretty rare in the science field,
Yeah, that's
unfortunately.
amazing. One more thing, Laila, as I'm thinking about you're talking about this, are there multiple different types of seagrasses and, groups have to decide
Yeah,
the plant like that
yeah,
is.
there's different species and people have to decide which ones. Usually they're planting them as larvae in the lab and then putting
Mhm.
the seedlings in. It depends on what is indigenous to the area and native, but also sometimes the native ones are no longer viable to be planted there. So it's a bunch of
Interesting.
different. Yeah.
Got it. Well, thank you so, so much. And thank you to everyone for being here with us. We are super appreciative, and Layla's information is here, so definitely reach out to her. The capstone presentation link is there, as well as Layla's email and LinkedIn. Thank you so much for being here with us, and we hope we see you again in our June Climate Live session.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, everyone.
Everyone.
Have
Bye.
a great night. Bye.